Rain slicked the pavement outside the Velvet Room, turning the neon signs into blurry, bleeding streaks of red and blue. Luca wasn't the kind of man to notice a stray dog, let alone a sobbing woman huddled by the dumpsters. He managed an empire built on extortion and enforced silence. But the sharp, ragged intake of her breath, hitching over the muffled bass thumping from inside his club, stopped him dead. He recognized that sound. It was the sound of someone's world breaking. The side door of the Velvet Room slammed shut, cutting off the heavy synthetic beat of the club's sound system. Out here in the alley, it was just the hiss of tires on wet asphalt from the distant avenue and the steady, freezing drizzle of a November night. Luca tugged the collar of his wool coat up against the wind. He was tired. A deep, bone-scraping exhaustion that came from smiling at politicians who despised him and threatening men who wanted him dead. "Cars out front, boss," Paulie mumbled, shivering as he lit a cigarette. The flame briefly illuminated the scarred expanse of the bodyguard's face. Luca didn't answer. His attention had snagged on a shadow, wedged in the narrow gap between the brick wall and a rusted commercial dumpster. At first, he thought it was a pile of discarded coats. Then the pile shuddered. "Leave it, Luca," Paulie said, his tone flat. "Junkie, probably, or a drunk. Club security will sweep 'em out in 10 minutes. Luca took a step forward. His leather shoes made a soft, splashing sound in the shallow puddles. He didn't know why he moved. Empathy was a liability in his line of work, a weakness that men with guns and ambition would carve out of you with a dull knife. But there was something about the rhythm of the crying. It wasn't the loud, performative wailing of a drunk who wanted attention. It was suppressed, desperate, the kind of crying done by someone who was terrified of being heard. He stopped 3 feet away. She had her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped around them in a tight, protective knot. She was wearing a beige trench coat that was soaked through, the fabric clinging to her shivering frame. Her hair, a tangled mess of damp brown strands, plastered against her cheeks. "Hey," Luca said. His voice was a low rumble, gravelly from too many cigars and not enough sleep. The woman flinched violently. She threw her hands up over her face, shrinking back until her shoulders slammed against the wet brick. She didn't scream. She just cowered, waiting for a blow. That flinch did something to Luca's chest. It was a visceral reaction, a sudden tightening of the muscles in his jaw. He had seen fear before. He manufactured it for a living. But the pure anticipatory terror radiating from this woman felt different. It felt like a trespass on something innocent. Slowly, deliberately, Luca reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean, folded linen handkerchief. He held it out. She peered through the gaps in her trembling fingers. Her eyes were swollen, the capillaries burst and red, staring at his outstretched hand as if it held a live grenade. The street lamp caught the side of her face. A dark, angry, purpling bruise was already blooming along her cheekbone, stark against her pale, freezing skin. Her lip was split, a thin line of dried rust running down to her chin. "Take it," Luca said, keeping his tone perfectly even. "No pity. Pity panicked people. You're bleeding." She hesitated, her chest heaving with stuttering breaths. Slowly her hand crept out. Her knuckles were scraped raw. She snatched the handkerchief and pressed it against her mouth, shrinking back against the wall. "Paulie," Luca said, not taking his eyes off her. "Yeah, boss? Bring the car around to the alley. We aren't going out front." Paulie paused, his heavy boots grinding on the gravel. "You sure about that? We got the sit-down with the Southside boys tomorrow. You really want to pick up a stray tonight?" "The car, Paulie." It wasn't a request. Paulie grunted, flicked his cigarette into a puddle, and walked away. Luca crouched down, ignoring the dirty water seeping into the knees of his tailored trousers. He stayed at a distance, giving her the illusion of space. "I'm not going to touch you," he said. "But you're going to freeze to death out here. My office is inside. It's warm. Nobody goes in there without my say-so." She stared at him, the handkerchief still pressed to her mouth. Her gaze darted from his expensive coat to his face, taking in the sharp angles, the dark, unreadable eyes. She was weighing the monster she knew against the monster she didn't. "Why?" she whispered. Her voice was cracked, barely more than a breath of air. "Because," Luca said, the cynicism bleeding through, "I hate a mess in my alley. Now, are you going to stand up, or do I have to call security to drag you out?" It was a harsh thing to say, but it worked. The blunt command snapped her out of her shock. She blinked, her jaw setting in a fragile line of defiance. Leaning against the dumpster, she forced herself up. Her legs wobbled. Luca didn't offer his hand. He knew she wouldn't take it. He just turned and pushed the heavy metal door to the club open, waiting for her to step out of the rain. The base was a physical entity inside the building, rattling the concrete walls. Luca led her away from the main floor, down a carpeted hallway bathed in dim amber light. The noise faded with every heavy, soundproofed door they passed through, until they reached the back wing. He keyed a code into a keypad. The oak door clicked open. His office was a stark contrast to the neon excess of the club outside. It was quiet, masculine, and expensive. Dark mahogany, leather armchairs, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that actually held books. A heavy crystal decanter sat on a side table next to a silver ice bucket. Luca walked straight to the thermostat and cranked it up. Then he went to the small ensuite bathroom, grabbed a thick heated towel off the rack, and walked back out. She was standing exactly where he had left her, just inside the doorway. She was dripping onto his Persian rug, her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the room with the wide, vacant eyes of someone waiting for the trap to spring. Luca tossed the towel. It landed over her head. "Dry off, then sit down." He walked to the drinks cart. He didn't offer her alcohol. Shock and whiskey were a bad mix. He poured himself 3 fingers of scotch, the amber liquid glinting in the low light. Then he grabbed a bottle of sparkling water, cracked the seal, and set it on the glass coffee table in front of the leather sofa. He took a seat behind his massive desk, putting distance between them, and took a slow sip of the scotch. The burn grounded him. She pulled the towel off her head, wiping the freezing rainwater from her face. She looked awful. The harsh lighting of the office showed the true extent of the damage. The bruise on her cheek was shaped like a knuckles. The collar of her blouse, visible beneath the trench coat, was torn. She walked over to the sofa, her movements stiff, and sat on the very edge of the cushion. She picked up the water bottle and drank, her hand shaking so badly the glass clinked against her teeth. "What's your name?" Luca asked. He leaned back in his chair, watching her. She swallowed hard. "Harper." "Just Harper?" "Harper Collins." A bitter, broken laugh escaped her. "Like the publisher. My mother thought she was funny." Luca didn't smile. "Who did this to you, Harper?" She froze. The bottle halted halfway to her mouth. She looked down at her knees, her wet hair falling forward to hide her face. "It was just a mugging. A guy in an alley a few blocks away. Wanted my purse. I fought back. It was stupid. It was a lie. It was a bad lie." Luca had spent 20 years reading the tells of liars, the shift in posture, the avoidance of eye contact, the rehearsed cadence of the words. But more than that, a mugger didn't leave a woman in this specific kind of psychological ruin. A mugger took the purse and ran. This was personal. This was someone who wanted to leave a mark. Luca set his glass down. The solid thunk echoed in the quiet room. "I'm not a cop, Harper," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I don't care about police reports or due process, but I do care about people lying in my office." She looked up, startled by the coldness in his tone. "A mugger hits you once and grabs the bag," Luca continued, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the deck. He doesn't grab you by the collar. He doesn't hold you against a wall. The bruising on your neck, the finger marks. They say somebody wanted you to look at him while he hit you. So I'll ask again. Who? A tear spilled over her lower lash line, cutting a clean track through the dirt and ruined makeup on her cheek. She scrubbed at it angrily with the back of her hand. "You don't understand," she whispered. He knows people. Dangerous people. If I go to the police, he said he'd kill my sister. He told me he'd burn her house down with her kids inside." "I know dangerous people too," Luca said mildly. "Not like him." Harper's voice shook. The dam was breaking. The adrenaline that had kept her moving was crashing, leaving only raw panic. "He does whatever he wants. Nobody stops him. The police, the judges, they all just look the other way because of who his family is." Luca went very still. In this city there were only a handful of families that commanded that kind of absolute, terrified compliance. And Luca did business with all of them. "Give me the name, Harper." She squeezed her eyes shut. She was terrified to even say it out loud, as if the syllables themselves would summon the devil. "Declan," she breathed out. "Declan Walsh." Luca didn't flinch, but the air in the room suddenly felt 20 degrees colder. Declan Walsh, the golden boy of the Walsh Syndicate, the untouchable heir to the Irish docks. Declan was a rabid dog wrapped in an expensive suit, a man who beat women, extorted local businesses, and caused endless headaches for everyone. But he was also the nephew of Brendan Walsh, the man Luca had spent the last 2 years negotiating a fragile, highly profitable peace treaty with. "How do you know Declan?" Luca asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Harper opened her eyes. She saw the shift in him, the sudden detachment, and she misinterpreted it. She thought he was scared. She thought he was backing off. She wrapped her arms around herself again. "I worked at the high-stakes tables at the Continental," she said, her voice deadening. "He was a regular. He tipped well. He asked me out. I said no. I kept saying no. Then the manager told me I was being let go. Said a VIP complained about my attitude. Tonight, when I left through the employee exit with my final check, he was waiting in his car." She swallowed heavily, her throat working. "He told me he owned the city. He told me he owned me. And when I tried to walk away, he dragged me into the alley." She didn't need to finish the story. The bruised cheek, the torn collar, the absolute devastation in her posture painted the rest of the picture. Luca stared at her. His mind, trained for decades in the brutal calculus of organized crime, immediately began running the numbers. Protecting this woman meant harboring the victim of a Walsh. If Declan found out she was here, he would demand her back, purely out of spite. Refusing him meant insulting Brendan Walsh. Insulting Brendan Walsh meant breaking the treaty. Breaking the treaty meant a turf war. A turf war meant lost revenue, dead men on the streets, and the feds sniffing around his legitimate fronts. The logical, cynical choice was simple. Give her $1,000 in cash, put her in a cab to the airport, and tell her to disappear. It was the smart play. It was the play his father would have made. It was the play Paulie would expect him to make. He looked at Harper. She was staring at her hands. The knuckles were still bleeding sluggishly onto his towel. She wasn't asking him to save her. She expected nothing. The world had just taught her a brutal lesson about power, and she had accepted her place at the bottom of the food chain. That resignation twisted something ugly and violent deep in Luca's gut. He remembered the sound of her crying by the dumpster, the sheer suffocating helplessness of it. He had built his empire so he would never have to feel that kind of helplessness again. He had built his power to control his environment, to insulate himself from the monsters. But what good was power if you still had to tolerate the monsters in your own backyard? Luca stood up. The leather chair squeaked in the silence. Harper flinched again, expecting him to throw her out. Instead, he walked over to the corner of the room, opened a heavy mahogany cabinet, and pulled out a first aid kit. He brought it over to the coffee table and sat down next to her on the sofa. He didn't sit too close, but close enough that he could smell the rain and fear on her. He opened the kit, pulling out a bottle of antiseptic and a cotton pad. "Give me your hand," he said quietly. Harper blinked, confused. She looked at his hands, large, scarred, heavy with gold rings, and then hesitantly placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, but surprisingly gentle. He dabbed the antiseptic onto her torn knuckles. She hissed in pain, trying to pull back, but he held fast. "Declan Walsh is a dead man," Luca said. He said it so casually, so conversationally, that it took a second for the words to register in Harper's brain. When they did, her eyes widened in absolute horror. "No!" she gasped, trying to pull her hand away. "No, you can't. You don't know who he is. You don't—" "I know exactly who he is," Luca interrupted, his voice a low, soothing rumble as he taped a piece of gauze over her knuckles. "I do business with his uncle. They run the ports. They're loud, they're messy, and they think the rules don't apply to them." "Then you know you can't cross them," she said, her voice rising in panic. "If you do anything to him, they'll kill you, and they'll find me. Please, just let me leave. I'll take a bus out of state. Harper," Luca said sharply, demanding her attention. She stopped rambling. She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the cold, dead calm in his dark eyes. It was a terrifying kind of stillness. The stillness of an apex predator that had just caught a scent. "I am Luca Moretti," he said softly. Harper sucked in a breath. The color, what little was left of it, drained entirely from her face. Even civilians who tried to ignore the criminal underbelly of the city knew the name Moretti. They were the old blood, the quiet power, the ones who didn't make noise but made people disappear. "Declan Walsh thinks he owns the city because his uncle lets him play with the toys," Luca continued, moving to her other hand and repeating the cleaning process. "He beats up cocktail waitresses because he's a coward who mistakes cruelty for strength, but he doesn't own this city." Luca finished bandaging her second hand. He closed the first aid kit and looked up, meeting her terrified, watery eyes. "I do." He stood up, walked over to his desk, and picked up the heavy black receiver of his landline. He dialed a 3-digit extension. "Poorly," Luca said when the line clicked. "Yeah, boss." "Call the captains. Tell them the sit-down with the South Side is cancelled. We're locking down the clubs. And tell Jimmy to get a crew together." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Paulie knew exactly what those orders meant. "We going to war, Luca?" Luca looked across the room at Harper. She was curled on his sofa, bruised, broken, and clutching a bloody towel. Yet she was the most real thing he had encountered in years. "Yeah, Paulie," Luca said, his voice cold as the grave. "We're going to war. Find out where Declan Walsh is drinking tonight, and tell Jimmy to bring the heavy equipment." He hung up the phone. The click echoed in the quiet office. The peace treaty was dead. His business was about to bleed money. The streets were going to catch fire. And for the first time in a decade, Luca Moretti felt entirely, deeply alive. The armored SUV idled in the alley, its exhaust curling into the freezing rain like grey ghosts. The rear door was heavy, lined with ballistic steel, and closed with a vault-like thud that locked the noise of the city outside. Harper sat huddled in the corner of the leather bench seat. She looked small, swallowed by the oversized coat and the encroaching reality of what she had just catalyzed. Luca sat opposite her. He didn't look at her, giving her the dignity of privacy as the adrenaline slowly seeped out of her system, leaving the raw, trembling exhaustion behind. He stared out the tinted window at the blurred streetlights. His phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket. Captains demanding clarification, Lieutenants asking for targets, the machine of his family waking up from a 2-year slumber, hungry and confused. He ignored them all. Paulie was in the passenger seat, his massive shoulders tense, speaking into a burner phone in hushed, clipped sentences. "Where are we going?" Harper asked. Her voice was thin, fragile, like old glass. "Somewhere quiet." Luca replied, without turning his head. "My club is a fortress, but everybody knows where it is. If Brendan Walsh wants to throw a tantrum when he hears what I'm about to do to his nephew, he'll send his boys there first. You aren't going to be there. You're putting yourself in danger for a stranger." Luca finally looked at her. The street lamps passing by cast rhythmic shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the cold intelligence in his eyes. "I'm a businessman, Harper. I don't do things for strangers. I do things for my own peace of mind, and Declan Walsh offended me." It was a lie. Partially. It was a justification for the sudden, violent urge that had possessed him the moment he saw her cowering in the alley. But she didn't need to know that. She needed stability. She needed to believe that the monster sitting across from her was in complete control. The SUV navigated through the wet streets, leaving the neon-soaked downtown behind, pulling into the affluent, quiet streets of the West End. They stopped in front of a narrow, 3-story brownstone wrapped in dark ivy. There were no lights on inside. Paulie got out first, scanning the empty street, his hand resting casually inside his jacket. He gave a sharp nod. Luca opened the door and stepped out into the drizzle, holding his hand out for Harper. She hesitated. The fear was still there, stamped into the lines around her mouth, but the alternative was the street, and Declan. She placed her bruised hand in Luca's. His grip was warm and entirely steady. Inside, the brownstones smelled of lemon oil, old paper, and dust. It wasn't lived in. It was a ghost house, maintained for emergencies exactly like this. Luca hit a switch, and soft lamps illuminated a tasteful, muted living room. Heavy curtains were already drawn tight across the windows. "Sit," Luca instructed, pointing to a plush armchair. "There's a doctor on his way. He works for me. He doesn't ask questions, and he doesn't have a tongue to wag. He's just going to look at your ribs and that cheek." Harper wrapped her arms around her waist, wincing as the movement pulled at her bruised torso. "I don't need a doctor. I just need to sleep. Or wake up. I don't even know what this is right now. You need a doctor," Luca said softly, but leaving no room for argument. "And you need to trust me. The worst part of your night is over, Harper. The worst part of Declan's night hasn't even started." He walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of tap water, and brought it back to her. She took it with shaking hands. "Will you—" She stopped, swallowing hard. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and haunted. "Will you kill him?" Luca looked down at her. He didn't offer her a comforting lie. He didn't sugarcoat the brutality of the world she had just stumbled into. "Not tonight," Luca said flatly. "Killing him tonight starts a war I haven't fully positioned my pieces for. Tonight is about sending a message. A very loud, very permanent message. Brendan Walsh needs to understand that his nephew crossed a line, and that the penalty for crossing that line is exacted in flesh." He saw her flinch, and for a fraction of a second, regret flared in his chest. He was frightening her, but he needed her to understand the reality of the safety he was offering. A sharp knock at the front door broke the silence. Paulie opened it, ushering in a small, balding man carrying a scuffed leather medical bag. "Doc." Luca nodded. He turned back to Harper. "Let him do his job. There's a bedroom upstairs, first door on the right. Lock it if you want. Paulie is stationed at the front door. Nobody gets past him. I'll be back before dawn." "Where are you going?" The question slipped out of her before she could stop it. A strange, desperate dependency had formed in the last hour. He was terrifying, but he was her terrifying monster right now. Luca adjusted the cuffs of his coat. To collect a debt. The Cobalt Lounge was a private, invitation-only cigar bar tucked away in the basement of a high-end steakhouse. It was where the city's worst men went to drink expensive bourbon and pretend they were gentlemen. It was also Declan Walsh's favorite place to hold court on Thursday nights. At 1:15 a.m., the heavy oak doors of the Cobalt Lounge did not open for a member. They splintered inward under the force of a breaching ram. The music, a low, sultry jazz tune, screeched to a halt as the needle was ripped off the record by the bartender diving for the floor. 5 men walked in. They didn't wear masks. They wore tailored suits and carried suppressed automatic weapons. Jimmy, a man with the dead eyes of a shark and a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, took point. The patrons, corrupt aldermen, union bosses, and mid-level mobsters, froze. Panic is loud, but pure, unadulterated terror is entirely silent. No one screamed. No one reached for a weapon. They all recognized Jimmy, and they all knew who held Jimmy's leash. In the back corner, sprawling on a velvet booth with 2 women and a bottle of crystal-cut vodka, was Declan Walsh. Declan was 26, handsome in a cruel, sharp-featured way, with blonde hair swept back from his forehead. He was currently staring at the men invading his sanctuary, his mouth slightly open, the arrogance slowly draining from his face as the reality of the situation bypassed his alcohol-soaked brain. The crowd parted as Luca walked through the shattered doorway. His footsteps were the only sound in the room. Slow, measured. He didn't look at the politicians scrambling under tables. He didn't look at the bartender praying behind the mahogany counter. His dark eyes were locked entirely on Declan. Declan tried to stand up, his bravado kicking in late. "Moretti, what the hell is this? You know whose place this is? You know who I am?" Luca stopped at the edge of the booth. He looked at the 2 women pressing themselves into the leather upholstery, terrified. He gave them a brief, dismissive flick of his hand. They scrambled out of the booth and ran. "Sit down, Declan," Luca said. The quietness of his voice made the hair on the back of the patrons' necks stand up. Declan remained standing, though his knees were noticeably trembling. "My uncle is going to hear about this. You're breaching the treaty, Luca. Over what? You want a bigger cut of the docks? You want to renegotiate? You call a sit-down. You don't kick in doors like a street thug." Luca didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He just moved. His hand shot out, grabbing Declan by the throat. The younger man choked, his eyes bulging as Luca slammed him backward onto the heavy glass table in the center of the booth. The table cracked underneath Declan's weight. Bottles and glasses shattered, raining liquor and glass onto the floor. Jimmy and 2 other men instantly stepped forward, forming a wall between Luca and the rest of the room. A few of Declan's bodyguards had finally found their courage and reached for their holsters. "Touch the steel," Jimmy warned, his gun leveling at the chest of the closest guard. "And I paint the wall with your lungs. Stand down." The guards slowly raised their hands, backing away. They were loyal to the Walsh family, but nobody wanted to die for Declan's stupidity in a basement bar. Luca leaned over Declan, his grip still tight around the boy's throat. Declan was thrashing, clawing at Luca's hand, his face turning a mottled purple. "You talk too much," Luca murmured, leaning in so only Declan could hear him. He smelled of cheap cologne, expensive vodka, and sweat. "You think this is about business? You think I care about your uncle's shipping containers?" Luca released his throat, pinning Declan to the broken table by his chest instead. Declan gasped for air, coughing violently. What do you want?" Declan wheezed, the panic finally overriding his ego. "A few hours ago you waited outside the Continental," Luca said. His voice was clinical, detached. "You put your hands on a woman named Harper. You dragged her into an alley. You hit her!" Declan's eyes darted frantically. Confusion mingled with the terror. "A waitress? You're doing this over a piece of trash casino girl? Are you insane?" "Luca, it was nothing. Just a misunderstanding. She owed me respect." The absolute entitlement, the total lack of comprehension in Declan's voice solidified something cold and hard in Luca's chest. He didn't feel anger anymore. He felt a mechanical necessity. "Hold his right arm," Luca commanded. Two of Luca's men stepped forward, grabbing Declan's right arm and pinning it flat against the remaining unbroken section of the heavy glass table. Declan started screaming now, a high, panicked sound. He thrashed like a netted fish, but the men holding him were immovable. "Luca, wait, please! We can pay you! My uncle will give you whatever you want!" Luca reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a heavy, steel retractable baton. With a flick of his wrist, it extended with a sharp, metallic clack. "This isn't a negotiation, Declan. This is a consequence." Luca raised the baton. He didn't swing wildly. He aimed with surgical precision. The steel cracked down on the back of Declan's hand. The sound of shattering bone was distinct, a sickening crunch that echoed over Declan's agonizing shriek. The boy convulsed, his eyes rolling back in his head. Luca didn't stop. He raised the baton and brought it down again. And again. Methodical. Brutal. He broke the hand that had bruised Harper's face. He pulverized the knuckles that had left a mark on her skin. He did it until there was nothing left to fix, until the hand was a ruined, useless mess of flesh and splintered bone. Declan passed out from the pain after the third strike, his head lolling to the side, spit bubbling at the corner of his mouth. Luca collapsed the baton and slid it back into his pocket. He looked down at the unconscious heir of the Walsh Empire. There was no satisfaction in his chest, only the heavy, looming weight of what was coming next. He turned to face the terrified crowd in the lounge. "Tell Brendan Walsh," Luca said, his voice carrying clearly across the dead, silent room, "that his nephew forgot his manners. If he has an issue with my teaching methods, he knows where to find me." He walked out of the lounge, his men falling in line behind him. The jazz record remained silent. The message had been delivered. The war had begun. The drive back to the brownstone was quiet. The rain had turned into a steady, freezing sleet, coating the windshield in a layer of slush. Luca sat in the back, staring at his hands. There was no blood on them, but they felt dirty. He had spent 10 years distancing himself from this kind of hands-on violence. He was a CEO of a shadow corporation. He dealt in logistics, leverage, and quiet intimidation. The visceral, bone-crunching brutality was supposed to be behind him, a relic of his 20s when he was fighting his way up from the streets. But tonight it had felt terrifyingly natural. The SUV pulled up to the ivy-covered brownstone. Polly didn't say a word as Luca got out. He just gave the grim nod. Paulie knew the score. By tomorrow morning the city would be holding its breath. By tomorrow night the bullets would start flying. Luca unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside. The house was exactly as he had left it. Quiet, dimly lit. Paulie was sitting in the kitchen, nursing a cup of black coffee, an assault rifle resting casually across his lap. He gestured upward with his chin. "Doc left an hour ago. Said she's got 2 cracked ribs, a mild concussion, and some deep bruising. Left some painkillers. She's awake." Luca nodded, taking off his wet overcoat and draping it over a chair. He walked up the wooden stairs. They creaked softly under his weight. He paused outside the guest bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. A sliver of warm, yellow light spilled out onto the hallway floor. He pushed it open. Harper was sitting on the edge of the large, 4-poster bed. She was wearing an oversized grey sweatshirt that the doctor must have found in one of the drawers. Her face was clean, the dirt and dried blood washed away. But it only made the dark, swollen bruising on her cheek and neck stand out more severely. She was holding a mug of tea, her bandaged hands curled tightly around the warm ceramic. She looked up when he entered. She didn't flinch this time. "You're back," she said softly. "I told you I would be." Luca stepped into the room, leaning against the doorframe. He felt suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a physical blow. "Did the doctor give you anything for the pain?" "Pills. They make me feel cloudy. I don't want to feel cloudy right now." She set the mug down on the bedside table. She looked at him, really studying him. She was searching for signs of a monster, looking for blood on his clothes or madness in his eyes, but he just looked like a tired man in a very expensive suit. "What did you do?" she asked. The question hung in the quiet air, heavy and loaded. "I ensured that Declan Walsh will never use his right hand to hit a woman again," Luca answered evenly. Harper sucked in a breath. She closed her eyes, a shudder running through her small frame. It wasn't fear, Luca realized. It was shock. It was the overwhelming realization that someone had actually stood up for her. In her world, the strong preyed on the weak, and the weak just endured. "His uncle," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "Brendan Walsh. He won't let this go. No, he won't. He'll come after you. He will try." Luca pushed off the doorframe and walked further into the room, stopping a few feet from the bed. "My family has been in this city for 3 generations, Harper. The Walshes run the ports, but we own the concrete. We own the politicians, the judges, the unions. Brendan is vicious, but he is emotional. I am not." He said it with such absolute certainty that Harper almost believed him. But she had seen the way his jaw clenched, the subtle tension in his shoulders. "Why me?" she asked. The tears were back, welling up in her eyes, threatening to spill over. "I'm nobody, Luca. I deal cards at a casino. I can't offer you anything. I can't pay you back. You risked your entire empire for a girl crying in an alley. It doesn't make sense." Luca looked at her. He looked at the bruised cheek, the cracked ribs, the utter despair in her eyes that was slowly being replaced by something else. A flicker of resilience. He walked over and sat on the edge of the mattress. The bed dipped under his weight. "Harper didn't pull away. When I was 14, Luca said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet rumble, a confession in the dark. "My father caught a rival lieutenant skimming from our numbers racket. He didn't just kill him, he made me watch while he beat the man to death with a pipe in a basement. He told me it was a lesson in power. He told me that the only way to survive in this world was to be the scariest thing in the room." Harper watched him, captivated by the sudden vulnerability in the eyes of a mob boss. "I learned the lesson," Luca continued, staring at the floorboards. "I became the scariest thing in the room. I built walls. I cut out empathy because it's a liability. But tonight, when I heard you crying, I didn't hear weakness. I heard someone who had been crushed by the exact same kind of monster my father was, and I realized that having all this power means absolutely nothing if I just let the monsters win." He looked up, meeting her eyes. The space between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken things. "You don't owe me anything, Harper. Not money, not loyalty. You aren't a pawn in this war. You're the reason I finally decided to start it." Harper stared at him. The tears finally spilled over, tracking down her unbruised cheek. But she didn't sob. She reached out, her bandaged fingers trembling, and lightly touched the sleeve of his jacket. It was a microscopic gesture, a tiny bridge built over a chasm of trauma and violence. "Thank you," she whispered. Luca looked at her hand on his sleeve. For the first time in years, he felt something fracture inside his chest, not breaking, just shifting. "Get some sleep," he said softly, standing up. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." He walked to their door. Just as his hand touched the knob, Harper's voice stopped him. "Luca." He looked back. "Will we survive this?" she asked. Luca Moretti looked at the woman who had just upended his entire universe. He thought of Brendan Walsh, assembling his killers in the dark. He thought of the blood that was going to paint the streets of his city. Yes, he lied, beautifully, perfectly. We will. The retaliation came at 6 a.m., right as the city's streetlights clicked off to welcome a bruised grey dawn. Luca was standing in the kitchen of the brownstone, staring into a cup of black coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. His phone sat on the marble island, a silent black rectangle. He was waiting for it to ring. He knew Brendan Walsh. The old Irishman didn't sleep on an insult. He was a creature of immediate, disproportionate violence. When the screen finally lit up, vibrating aggressively against the stone, Luca picked it up on the first ring. Yeah. It's Rossi! Paulie's voice crackled through the speaker. The big man sounded out of breath, the background noise a chaotic symphony of sirens and shouting. They hit the diner on 8th. 2 cars pulled up, automatic weapons. They didn't even get out of the vehicles, just sprayed the front window and kept driving. Luca's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles turned white. Rossi was one of his oldest captains, a man who had bounced Luca on his knee 30 years ago, a man who was 3 months away from retiring to Florida. Rossi? Luca asked. The word felt like swallowing glass. He's gone, boss, Paulie said grimly. Took 2 in the chest. 3 of our guys are in the ICU. A waitress caught a stray to the shoulder. It's a mess. The cops are swarming. Luca closed his eyes. The calculus of war. He had initiated it, but the cost was always extracted from the people standing next to him. Lock down the territories, Paulie. Nobody goes to their usual spots. Tell the street crews they are cleared hot. If they see a Walsh car in our zip code, they don't wait for permission. He hung up. The kitchen was dead silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. He didn't hear her come down the stairs. Who died? Luca turned. Harper was standing in the archway, wearing the same oversized grey sweatshirt. She looked pale, clutching the doorframe for support, her ribs clearly protesting the movement. She had heard enough. A friend, Luca said. He didn't see the point in lying. A captain in my organization. Harper's breath hitched. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes darting away from him, staring at the floorboards. Because of me. No, Luca corrected sharply. Because of Brendan Walsh. Don't do that! Harper looked up, and for the first time, there was genuine anger cutting through her fear. Don't treat me like an idiot to spare my feelings. Declan hurt me. You broke his hand. Now they killed your friend. This is my fault. If I had just taken the beating and gone home, your friend would be eating breakfast right now. She pushed off the doorframe and turned toward the mudroom, where her ruined, damp trench coat was still hanging over a chair. What are you doing? Luca asked, taking a step toward her. I'm leaving. She grabbed the coat, her movements jerky and frantic. I'm going to the police. I'll confess to something. I'll tell them Declan did it. I'll go into protective custody. I'll get out of your way. I can't let innocent people die because I was too weak to fight my own battles. Luca closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He grabbed the coat, pulling it out of her hands and tossing it onto the floor. You aren't going anywhere. You can't keep me here, she yelled, pushing at his chest. Her hands were bandaged and weak, her push barely registering against his solid frame. But she kept pushing, tears of raw frustration spilling over her bruised cheeks. I am a casino waitress. I am collateral damage. Stop burning your life down for me. Luca caught her wrists. He didn't squeeze. He just held them firmly, stopping her frantic assault. He looked down into her tear-streaked face, his own expression entirely calm, an anchor in the middle of her panic. Listen to me, he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble. Brendan Walsh has been looking for an excuse to break our treaty for 6 months. He's bleeding cash on the docks, and he wants my supply lines. If it wasn't you, it would have been a dispute over a truck route next week, or a rigged poker game next month. You are just the spark, Harper. You are not the powder keg. She stopped struggling, her chest heaving, her eyes searching his for a lie. But your friend, she whispered, the guilt still choking her. Rossi knew the life he chose. He knew the risks, Luca said, his voice hardening. But Brendan Walsh made a tactical error today. He let his temper dictate his first move. He killed a beloved old man in a public place. He lost the moral high ground with the other families, and he brought the police down on his own head. He thinks he's fighting my father's war. He's not. Luca let go of her wrists. He reached up, his scarred thumb gently wiping a tear from her unbruised cheek. The touch was startlingly intimate, a stark contrast to the violence they were discussing. You don't run, Luca told her softly. Not from Declan, not from Brendan, and not from me. You stay right here, and you let me finish what they started. Harper looked at him, the cynical, exhausted casino girl warring with the woman who desperately wanted to believe in safety. Slowly she gave a microscopic nod. Luca stepped back. The softness vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating CEO of a criminal empire. I have to leave. Keep the doors locked. Don't answer the phone. When I come back, this will be over. Luca didn't go to the streets. He didn't gather a dozen men with shotguns and drive to the Irish neighborhoods to shoot up pubs in a tit-for-tat bloodbath. That was how you lost a war. You lost a war by letting anger dictate your logistics. Instead, he went to a nondescript office building in the financial district. Sitting in a sterile, glass-walled conference room, Luca met with 3 men in expensive suits. They weren't soldiers. They were forensic accountants and maritime lawyers on his payroll. Brendan Walsh pays his enforcers in cash, Luca told them, staring at a map of the city's ports spread across the table. He generates that cash through Container Terminal 4, untaxed electronics, stolen luxury cars, and heavy narcotics. It all funnels through there before it hits the street. Terminal 4 is locked down tight, Mr. Moretti, the lead accountant said, adjusting his glasses. Union guys, loyal to Walsh. You can't just walk in. I don't want to walk in, Luca said. I want to freeze it. The harbour master has a gambling problem. He owes the DeMeo family 200 grand. I bought his debt this morning. Luca pulled a folded document from his jacket and slid it across the glass table. Call him. Tell him I'm calling the marker in. I want Terminal 4 quarantined by the Coast Guard for a random, comprehensive hazardous materials inspection. I want every single crate opened, catalogued, and stalled for a minimum of 72 hours. The lawyer blinked, realizing the magnitude of the move. If the Coast Guard opens those crates, they'll find the contraband. Brendan's entire incoming shipment will be seized by the federal government. He'll lose $8 million in a single afternoon. Exactly, Luca said flatly. And when his soldiers realize he doesn't have the cash to make payroll on Friday, their loyalty to the Walsh name will evaporate. You have 1 hour to make the call. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the news broke on the local channels. A massive federal raid at Terminal 4. Brendan Walsh's lifeblood had been severed with a phone call. No bullets, no bodies, just a systemic, catastrophic financial amputation. When Luca returned to the brownstone that evening, he was dead on his feet. The adrenaline had burned off, leaving a hollow ache in his bones. The house was quiet, filled with the rich, heavy scent of garlic, tomatoes, and simmering beef. He found Harper in the kitchen. She was standing at the stove, stirring a large pot of marinara sauce. She had found a pair of sweatpants and a clean white t-shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun. She looked domesticated, out of place in a safe house, yet entirely grounded. She turned when she heard his heavy footsteps. She took one look at his face, the dark circles under his eyes, the brutal set of his jaw, and turned the burner off. "You look like hell," she said softly. I feel like it. Luca took off his suit jacket, dropping it over a stool. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing a long, jagged scratch along his forearm where he had caught it on a piece of exposed rebar at a construction site earlier that day. Harper walked over, pulling a clean dish towel from the counter. She wet it under the warm tap and stepped up to him. He didn't pull away. He let her take his arm. She wiped the dried blood away from the scratch with slow, careful movements. Her bandaged fingers were clumsy, but her touch was incredibly light. "It's over," Luca said, breaking the silence. His voice was a rasp. "Or the worst of it is, Brendan is bleeding out financially. He'll call for a sit-down by tomorrow morning." "Are you safe?" she asked, keeping her eyes on his arm. "I'm the one who makes other people unsafe, Harper." She stopped wiping. She looked up, her gaze locking onto his. "That's a line you feed your enemies to scare them. It doesn't work on me anymore. I asked if you were safe." Luca stared at her. He realized, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, that she was right. The armor he wore for the world didn't fit when he was standing in front of her. She had seen him commit unspeakable violence. She knew exactly what he was. And yet she was standing here, washing his arm, demanding he admit his own vulnerability. "I will be. After tomorrow." He finally conceded. Harper let out a long breath. She stepped back, tossing the towel onto the counter. "I made dinner. It's just pasta and sauce from jars I found in the pantry. It's not the continental, but it's hot." They ate in silence at the small kitchen table. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the shared quiet of two people who had survived a car crash and were simply grateful to be sitting upright. Luca ate 2 massive bowls. It was the first real food he had consumed in 2 days. After dinner, Luca moved to the living room couch. He didn't want to go upstairs. He wanted to stay near the front door. He lay down, fully clothed, kicking his shoes off, his gun resting on the floor within inches of his hand. He was asleep before his head fully settled into the cushion. Sometime in the middle of the night, he felt a weight settle over him. He cracked his eyes open just enough to see Harper pulling a heavy quilt over his shoulders. She lingered for a second, her hand resting lightly on his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. Luca didn't move. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a decade, he slept without dreaming of blood. The text message came at 7 a.m. A burner number, a set of coordinates. "The old rail yard, North End, noon. Just you and your lieutenants." Luca deleted the message. It was time. The rail yard was a graveyard of rusted boxcars and overgrown weeds on the edge of the city limits. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of old warehouses, carrying the bitter scent of industrial decay. Luca arrived in a 2-car convoy. He stepped out of the SUV, the freezing wind whipping the hem of his long black overcoat. Paulie and Jimmy flanked him, carrying assault rifles openly. There was no need for concealment out here. Across the expanse of cracked concrete, Brendan Walsh stood waiting. Brendan was a large man who had gone soft in his 50s, his face florid and mapped with broken capillaries from a lifetime of whiskey. He was surrounded by a dozen armed men. They looked nervous, their eyes darting around the rail yard, waiting for an ambush. Standing slightly behind his uncle was Declan. His right arm was encased in a thick white cast, suspended by a sling. He looked pale, gaunt, and entirely stripped of the arrogant sneer he had worn at the Cobalt Lounge. He looked at Luca, and physical terror seized him. He took a step backward. Luca walked forward until he was 10 feet from Brendan. He didn't look at the guns pointed at him. He didn't look at Declan. He looked at the old man. "You broke the treaty, Luca!" Brendan spat, his thick Irish brogue thickening with anger. "Over a whore! You crippled my nephew! You cost me my best captain, and you tipped the feds off to my ports! You're a dead man walking!" Rossi was a dead man. Luca corrected, his voice carrying effortlessly over the wind. "You sent shooters to a public diner. You panicked, Brendan. And panic is bad for business." "I'll burn your clubs to the ground!" Brendan roared, a vein pulsing in his forehead. "I've got 200 men ready to march on the West End. You think freezing one shipment stops me?" Luca sighed. It was the tired sound of a man dealing with a slow child. He reached into his coat. A dozen guns instantly raised, the metallic clatter of safeties clicking off, echoing in the yard. Paulie and Jimmy didn't flinch. They kept their weapons leveled. Luca slowly pulled out a manila envelope. He tossed it onto the frozen concrete between them. "Pick it up," Luca said. Brendan glared at him, then nodded to one of his men. The soldier stepped forward, grabbed the envelope, and handed it to the boss. Brendan ripped it open. Inside were bank statements, offshore accounts, shell company ledgers. It was the entire financial architecture of the Walsh Syndicate, complete with account numbers and routing codes. Brendan's face drained of its florid color. He looked up at Luca, his mouth opening and closing in silent shock. "You don't have 200 men, Brendan," Luca said smoothly, "because you can't pay them. As of an hour ago, my people bypassed your digital security. Every cent you have hidden in the Caymans, in Zurich, in Panama, it's gone. I routed it into blind trusts. Your empire is broke." You can't," Brendan stammered, the reality of his total ruin crashing down on him. "I just did." Luca took a single step forward, establishing absolute dominance. "You are obsolete, Brendan. Your men are already looking for new employers. By tonight, they'll realize you can't cover their bail or their paychecks, and they will abandon you." Luca finally shifted his gaze to Declan. The boy flinched, trying to hide behind his uncle's bulk. "Here are the terms," Luca said, his voice cold and ringing with finality. "You retire today. You take whatever cash you have in your mattress, you take your nephew, and you get on a plane to Dublin. If I see Declan's face in this city again, I won't just break his other hand. I will bury him under the foundation of my next casino. And you, Brendan, will hand over control of the ports to your lieutenant, Mickey. Mickey is a reasonable man. Mickey understands that my supply trucks take priority." Brendan crushed the papers in his fist. He was a proud man, a violent man, but he wasn't suicidal. He looked around at his own men. They were looking at the papers in his hand, then looking at Luca. The shift in power was palpable. Loyalty in their world was rented, and Brendan's lease had just expired. "You're a snake, Moretti," Brendan whispered, his voice cracking with defeat. "I'm a businessman," Luca replied, "and you're dismissed." Luca turned his back on a dozen armed men, the ultimate display of contempt and control, and walked back to his SUV. Paulie and Jimmy backed up slowly, keeping their rifles raised until Luca was securely inside. As the convoy pulled away from the rail yard, Luca let out a long, slow breath. The tension bled out of his muscles. The war was over. He had won. He hadn't just protected his territory, he had absorbed his rival's infrastructure without firing a single shot of his own. But as he watched the grey city roll by his window, he wasn't thinking about the ports, or the money, or the fear he had instilled in the Irish mob. He was thinking about a pot of marinara sauce, and a girl in an oversized sweatshirt. When the SUV pulled up to the brownstone, the sleet had finally stopped. A weak, anemic sun was trying to break through the cloud cover. Luca unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Harper was sitting in the living room, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring blankly at the wall. When she heard the door click, she stood up quickly. She searched his face, her breath catching in her throat, looking for bad news. Luca took off his coat and hung it on the hook. He walked over to her. He didn't stop a few feet away this time. He closed the distance entirely, stopping only when their chests were nearly touching. "Pack your things." Luca said quietly. Harper's face fell. The fragile hope she had been harboring shattered. He had won, and now he was getting rid of her. She was a liability, a loose end. "Where am I going?" she asked, her voice cracking. "To my penthouse," Luca said. She blinked, confused. "What?" Luca reached up, his large, scarred hand gently cupping the side of her unbruised face. His thumb stroked her cheekbone. "Declan is gone. Brendan is gone," Luca told her, his dark eyes boring into hers, completely open, stripped of the cynical armor. "You are entirely, irrevocably safe. You don't have to hide in a dusty brownstone anymore. You don't ever have to go back to dealing cards for men who don't see you." Harper stared up at him. She saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't discarding her. He was claiming her. Not as a possession, the way Declan had tried to do, but as a partner, as an equal who had looked at the monster in the dark and hadn't run away. "Your world is dangerous, Luca," she whispered, leaning into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. "It is," he agreed softly, lowering his head until his forehead rested against hers. "But as long as I am breathing, Harper, my world belongs to you." She smiled. It was a small, broken thing, but it was real. For the first time in her life, she wasn't standing in an alley waiting for the blow to fall. She was standing in the eye of a hurricane, held by a man who had ripped a city apart just to ensure she never had to cry in the rain again. Luca risked his entire empire and changed the criminal landscape of the city, all to protect a woman who accidentally crashed into his life. Their story proves that sometimes the most brutal monsters are the only ones capable of providing true safety. If you loved watching Luca outsmart the Walsh family and claim Harper as his own, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more intense, grounded Mafia romance dramas. Don't forget to ring the notification bell and share this video with your fellow romance addicts. Let us know in the comments, what was your favorite tactical move Luca made?